Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so why don't we go ahead and get started on the our. This seems to be the last panel already of the con. So I know it's sad, but also I get to go take a nap, so that's good. So, yep. Okay, so we are doing world building and fantasy, and Daniel Humphreys is doing the honors of the moderation this time.
So it's a good thing you're not talking a lot. Turn it on.
Well, I'm not going to talk a lot because in my fantasy universe, I just kind of take our world and tweak it a little bit. So I cheat, don't really build a whole lot. So let's just have everybody introduce themselves and we'll get started.
Is this working? I don't think it's working.
I'm probably louder without it.
Hello? Yeah. Hi there. All right, that's better. So I'm Jagi Lamplighter, and I have written both urban fantasy meets Dante and Shakespeare, and Lovecraft meets Narnia at Hogwarts.
I'm Ann Lewis, and I write space fantasy. It's been a big debate as to whether it's space opera or space fantasy. I've called it space opera, but I think that's kind of what space fantasy is. I have big badass guys with swords and people with powers, but they do run around in spaceships. So it's kind of influenced by Star Wars, and only my guys use live steel. So that's yeah. Go ahead.
I'm Herman Hunter. I write fantasy. It's Christian-esque. Does like Cthulhu eat Harry Potter?
No.
No. That would be funny though. I always wanted to have the Harry wizards meet each other. Harry Dresden meet Harry Potter. Who would win? I thought it'd be
See if I can fit it in.
You're a wizard, Harry.
Harry wizard Harry. No time.
Oh yeah. Except now he's on strike.
Is this one working?
You gonna bring that one around?
Yeah, that way we can reach out.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. I didn't mean to.
Crossing the
Don't
streams
cross
is
the
bad.
streams.
It's
No.
bad.
So, go ahead.
Okay, so let's see here. So obviously there are varying levels of world building. You can have a world that's basically completely different from our own. I guess what is your level of preference in your own writing, and why is that? We can start with Herman, or you can just go this way. Yeah.
I kind of like. I do have a whole world. My stuff started. My journey started like over 20 years ago, and I wrote a book, tried to get it published, and it didn't get published. It sucked at that time. But I have a whole world that I've sort of built in my head, and it's based off of, the Bible, mostly pre-Mosaic Bible, flavors of it, Christianity, and pieces of it like that. But as far as what I put into each of my books, you notice my books are not hugely thick. I only drop in what I need, because one of the problems with a lot of books, especially fantasy books, is they come out as these massive tomes with a huge info dump of lore and backstory and history and lineage. And some people eat that up. A lot of them don't, and I try and write for both.
Not everybody can be a Tolkien who created not just this wonderful world, but a whole, several languages and all this other wonderful stuff. I mean, he spent more time in his world building than anything else, I think. And so I think when people are giving you the info dumps and all that other stuff, it's because, they were influenced by Tolkien, and they don't do it as well. For me, the world building came from I had these concept of characters, and I tried to find a world that they would inhabit. And from that, it kind of grew from that. But it is kind of what he was saying is that you add in the bits of information that are necessary for telling the story, and they have to be introduced organically, or they kind of jump out at you. You can't have a big info dump. Hey, this is the background of my story. Here's the prologue where I tell you all about this universe. No, no, no. You got to kind of ease people and have them come into your universe and kind of inhabit it, and then you add those things that are different, that make it a different world. I mean, my people are on a different planet entirely. What does that mean? But they are like, I guess you call them Noahide. So they were kind of like pre-Jews, but they're from Sumeria, ancient Sumeria. So what does that do to influence their culture? Why are they the way they are? How do they act? And so you see that Sumeria, you know, as much as we know about Sumeria, and I tried to make that the influence and in their culture and how they behave and how they enter rituals and how they, you know, interact with each other. And that built itself, because if my view of them is that they are ancient Sumerians that have now kind of progressed forward. Where does that start? And that built the world. So
It's interesting how different people have different takes on this. My husband starts with the plate tectonics when he's doing a new background.
That's deep.
I don't go that far down, but in my current, so the series that I'm currently writing is based on a role-playing game, and the role-playing game was one of these kitchen sink games where the moderator put at Hogwarts, which is where the original game took place. Everybody from Superman to Doctor Doom to Kiki, the little witch. And they all came from other planets, and they had been brought to this place, and they've turned into children and forgot who they were for reasons related to what was going on. So when I decided I wanted to write it up, because it was just such a wonderful idea, not that part of it, the other parts of it, I didn't really think through the fact that not only was I going to have to make up my Earth with magic, but I had to make up another world for every single one of these other characters. So I've had to do the world building over and over again, because within my actual story, I do this similar world building to what I did in my Prosper series, which is it's modern Earth, but there's magic, and the magic is hidden, and the creatures are the creatures of all the different mythologies that you can interact with. But for some of the others, like he had a whole bunch of superhero characters, so I said, okay, I want to mix it up a little. I'm going to put them in fantasy version of medieval France. So I translated, Superman into Roland and all these other things. And for other characters, I just had to start from scratch, okay, I'm going to make up something completely new. It's going to be an underwater city, or it's, I'm going to have a space, my version of every federation or empire, and just make up my own and how they worked. So I've had to do a lot of world building for it. And I think I'll say one of the basic things in world building that I find is that if there's something particularly when you're trying to move a character over and you're doing what we call filing off the serial numbers, you want to take the thing that you want to have, whether it's flying brooms or travel between planets or whatever it is, and you want to come up with a new idea, a new understanding of that thing. Because the reader is coming to your story. If they wanted to see the original version, they'd be going to read about that. So they're coming to see a new take on something. And by the time you make up new specifics, then you can logically derive from those specifics other things. And that's what begins to build the word building, is that you set up a few things, then you think, what's logically going to come from that? And then you try to put that into your culture. And when you have a lot going on, it can be difficult, but you just try to approach it that way.
Kind of taking off on that, I'm curious. I'm a bit of a pantser in that I don't necessarily know what direction the road may take. I know what point A and point B are. So to that regard, my world building kind of reflects that in a sense for, like 2 current series, just because, they are basically based in reality. So there's not a whole lot I have to do there other than, add certain things. Do you find that in your more intense world building that affects the plot to some extent, where if you're going to be doing certain things, you have to build that structure up underneath?
Yeah. I have 2 wonderful friends who let me run them at like 1 or 2 lines a day in a role-playing game for over 10 years in the background, so that I can just try things out. Like, what if I do the magic? Okay, that didn't work. This way I can try to know ahead of time what I need to set up, so that, when I have this kind of magic or this kind of problem, sometimes it totally takes me by surprise anyway. But I do feel I try to have a sense that the things develop in such a way that the reader has some idea of what's possible.
Sure.
Or if they don't, it's because the characters in the world also are taken by surprise, which is legitimate. But that has, that you have to have a good sense of what the world thinks is normal and real if you want something like that.
I'm like you in that I'm more of a pantser than a plotter. I do know point where I want to start and where I want to end, and I kind of have an idea of what the points are in between, but that changes, and it's we call it pantsing. By the way, who does not know when we say plotter and pantser, what we're talking about? Okay, let me explain. If you are someone who writes out the plot to your novels or your story ahead of time, and you follow that pretty closely, you're a plotter. If you write by the seat of your pants, you are a pantser. And Tolkien, believe it or not, even while he was very detailed in his world building and created a lot of his world building and all these languages and everything else like that, he really was a pantser. He called himself a discovery writer. As discovery writer is another term for it, where he said, I never envisioned Tom Bombadil, but suddenly there he was, and that happens to me as I'm writing along. Some of my first books that I wrote were Sherlock Holmes pastiches, and Sherlock Holmes found a body he wasn't expecting. I certainly wasn't expecting it, but I let the character take control, and suddenly he turns the corner and boom, there's a body laying there that I hadn't expected that body to be lying there, but it just sort of appeared. And that sort of weird thing sort of happens when you're creating, you're a pantser. Now, as I said, we know at point A, we know the beginning and the end, we kind of know where we want our characters to go, and they just sort of kind of go there. I tell you what, Declan Finn yells at me because I don't plot things out as detailed as probably I could. But you do realize as you're going along, I need a structure for this. I need to have this backup plan. Oh yeah, I kind of need this sort of ritual to go in here. I kind of need this. And so then you go back and you think about it, and then you realize, hey, I could add hints of that back here, So I'm not really editing my work as I write, but I do kind of go, I should really make it. So I go back to the previous chapter and say, insert something about this here, and then I write, because I use Microsoft Word. I'm probably old-fashioned in that way, because I know a lot of people use what's it, Scrivener, and Scrivener probably would be better at that, but I can't get my mind around that. But I do go back into previous parts and add little notes, and those become world building moments, where hey, I need to establish a such and such, and I will go back and do that.
My husband talks about the time in the early days of email where he got an email from me saying, "Help, the cat took over the scene."
The cat took over the what?
The cat took over the scene. It's from the Prospero books, when her familiar started talking and I hadn't been expecting. I think the best, before we go on to the best description I ever heard of this type of writing is Sir Terry Pratchett, who said that he described writing as he knew where the peaks were, but the valleys were filled with mist. So he walked through the mist-filled valley discovering things, but there were also peaks that he already had established when he started.
And to think, I thought that, pantsing was you wrote with your pants on. This is a revelation to me, man. I knew what pantsing was. Basically, I started out with a whole concept of my world and what I wanted in it. But where I started 20 years ago ain't where I ended up today. A lot of the elements are still in place, but I've come up with brand new ideas in that time because I've had time to think about it, and I wrote books along those same lines. The thing is I think if you structure your world building too much, you leave yourself no room to wiggle if you come up with better ideas, which is the reason why I'm not a very good plotter, because I'm always coming up with new ideas, and it's like, that would be cool for this, but if I have to stay to a rigid outline, I'm kind of screwed. So I think there's a middle ground, and I'm along the lines of Terry Pratchett here. I know where all the peaks are, but stuff in between, that's stuff I make up as I go along.
Yeah.
Did I answer that question?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, so I it was interesting you bring up Tolkien. I think there's very much a separation between world building and the actual story itself at times. Tolkien, he's A+ on both levels. His story and his world building kind of go together hand in hand. Whereas you can have someone like, say, Rothfuss, who has great world building, but he's gotten to a certain point and apparently has just stopped. At what point, I guess, do you, basically you can do anything you want when you build the world, you just have to sell it for the audience. Has there ever been a time where you have said, okay, I really want to do this, but I'm not sure that I can do it? And did you pull it off, or did you go a different direction?
Am I starting?
Yeah.
Ready to
Yeah.
answer that
Yeah.
question. We're pondering that.
I'm getting really deep here. I'm sorry.
What was the question again? I'm old. You have to explain it to me again.
So, when developing a story, I can say, oh, the cat's going to talk, and if you can sell that, it'll work. But have you ever had a moment where you just want to build something and, you have abandoned it, or you didn't know you could pull it off? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I've abandoned several books
Yeah.
already. In fact, the one that preceded The Revenant and the Tomb, that one got abandoned because the middle of it just sucked.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually took that character and redid it again, or redid him again. And in that character, I was actually going to use him as a one-time deal to sort of highlight some of the past that existed in my world. And even stuff that I've abandoned before, I'm pulling elements from, and I'm going to be bringing them into the books because they're good ideas.
Sure.
They're good things. But not everything's going to come in. And even all the stuff that I've got figured out in my head's not going to be there because, even if you take a look at Lord of the Rings, there's only a sliver of Tolkien's imagined world in all of his writing. Christopher frickin' Tolkien, he wrote like an entire encyclopedia, multi-volume encyclopedia of his dad's writings, and there's stuff in there like elvish wedding practices that he initially came up with, that you don't see that in any of the books. So you take the good ideas and you use them, but you only use that stuff that you actually need, and don't, ideally you don't infodump, even though some people like it.
I think we, in the process of editing your own work, which is really hard to do, you kind of have to, it's kind of like the kill your darlings thing, where you might write this whole scene, you may really love it, and oh my gosh, it's so great, but yet you have to yank it out because it doesn't push the story forward. And I had that happen in several places where, gosh, I love this discussion. It's a really great, maybe it was trying to make a point that I was trying to make. I don't know. But yeah, it's not going anywhere. And really having great beta readers saying, hey, this is not really useful, we like to talk about Tolkien. We like to talk about Tom Bombadil and how he was useful or how he wasn't useful. I think a modern editor would have pulled him out because,
One of the best
Yeah.
parts.
even though he's one of the most charming parts of that book, modern because he doesn't really push the force. He doesn't really influence the story that much, and that's really kind of sad because he's a really sweet character, and I really enjoyed that. It was a certain, yeah. Go ahead.
Does really influence the whole sense of the world.
He does.
It makes the world feel much bigger than it would feel without him.
Yes.
Well, he is also a convenient plot device to get the hobbits out of the Barrows, so out of the way the Barrow writes, if I remember correctly.
That could be too.
Okay, so put him in there. Yeah.
Someone needs to write a Tom Bombadil story. We got to see one.
My
So,
Yeah.
speaking of that, so in the it's really funny because that line ties together the two separate things I wanted to say. So my husband has a long-running role-playing game. It's been running for 30 years. It's called the Corruption Campaign. It's a multiverse game with the 9 princes, Amber at the center. And I've tried to write this up. I've started 14 times. I've written an entire book called On Across the Stars that would have been volume 1. But for various reasons, it just hasn't quite worked. But in that background, Tom Bombadil was also Santa Claus. They were the same person. And it's funny you mention it because in the first Prosper book, Prosper Lost, she goes to visit Santa Claus. And I made him the same Santa Claus that was kind of influenced by Tom Bombadil. And one of my early readers told me that this was ridiculous and I should take it out. And I was able to say, this is the favorite scene in this book of two other of the early readers. So it stayed. But, it was, I had to go over that scene a lot to make it work and make it in the right mood. It was a Santa Claus who had very elegant elves working there. So the elves were in the same mood of the rest of it. So it kind of worked. But, there are certain things that are hard to do. There in the book I just came out on Monday, my main character goes to heaven. And in the original scene from the original game, it was just kind of a thing. And when I finished the first draft of the book, I thought, you can't have going to heaven be just kind of a thing. So I had to rewrite it about 6 times to make it so that it kind of made it feel like something important. And I guess it worked because I got a note in the middle of the night from Thailand and another one from Canada from beta readers who said that they really, really liked that scene. So I guess it pulled it off, but it was hard. And I wasn't sure for a while, if it was going to work at all. So I think it does happen that there are things that we want to put in and you just don't know if they're going to work. I had a children's book I wrote once that never got published that had Pinocchio in it. And my beta reader said, this doesn't work at all. Nobody wants to read about Pinocchio.
In my non-fantasy series stuff with Sherlock Holmes, I wrote the Watson Chronicles, which is about Watson talking about his own personal experiences in life, right? A little bit. And one of the stories in it, because there is an overarching story, it's a novel and story. So you have a bunch of short stories and they create a novel. And one of the stories in it was addressing the problem of Watson's wives, because Watson mentions that he was married once and married twice, and yet there's mentions of wives when there shouldn't have been wives at the particular time. And there mentions, it's just, Doyle didn't keep track of his own continuity. So, but I tried to explain the Watson wife problem in this story, and it just did not fit with the overarching story that I was trying to tell. And I had to pull the whole story out. So I was holding on to this story for like 3 years. So it was a great idea. The story was great. Finally, a Sherlockian magazine agreed to publish that story so by itself and I had to rewrite it because it was using the wrong character. So it turned out pretty good in the end.
That's because Doyle didn't know about the multiverse.
He did not. No.
Multiverse fixes everything.
In the Prosperous series, I have a whole scene that takes place during the Fire of London in 1666, I think it was, that I put in there just as setup for something that when I got to the last book, I couldn't make it work. It had to happen before an event that had to come before it. And that cannot be done. I mean, there was no time travel in this story, and I had to let it go. And it was really painful because I thought it was going to be cool, involve the Holy Grail, but I had to let it go.
I don't really have anything else off the top of my head. Does anybody have any questions?
Worldbuilding. So there are, it seems there are two approaches. World building and worry about the story later, thinking about I want to explore a theme, I want to explore a concept, and I need to build a world around that in the story later. Or I have a plot, I have a story, I have points that I want to get to that I only have to achieve, and I build a world to facilitate that. Pros and cons to each, or is it a really, what feels best to the individual?
It is kind of that, pros and cons. And there's actually a third option, is you have characters in your heart or your mind, and you want to give them a world that they inhabit, and you want them to encounter that and be challenged by that world. And that's kind of where mine came from. It came from the first character that I created. And she's not the main character. She's one of the main characters, but she is not the main character. From her, I got the main character. And then from him, I got this universe that he inhabits, which was his culture. And then I ended up building around that to get the entire world. So it kind of came from the people. And I told a story that challenged those characters. Does that make sense? So I created a world around the character. So there's a third option, and it can be yes and a combination of all three.
I think in the ideal situation, you do both. Yeah. So when I wrote the Prospero books, I wrote them all before they got published. So I was able to both work out the world and then go forward and set up things and come back and put in the notes and go back. And so that the beginning and the end are really well tied together. But right now I'm book 7 of a 21 book series. I can't do that because book 1 through 6 are published. So when you're doing something that's ongoing, you're under a lot more pressure to try to figure out where you might go ahead of time to make sure that at least you're supporting the major points you want to come to. Occasionally I, moan and groan because I really wish I put this in book 2, but it's too late now. Yeah. See, my book is complaining.
Time travel series. No.
Yeah,
Go back and change it.
unfortunately, I have a multiverse, but not a time.
That was my
multiverse.
second suggestion. Time travel fixes everything.
Yeah.
I hate
Oh no, it creates some more problems. I was only kidding. I was only kidding.
I didn't say it was serious. I just said time travel fixes everything.
I hate
For
to
good.
beat Tolkien like a dead horse, but you almost wonder if he had moderated his world building a little bit, how much more productive he might have been. That's always my fear, I guess, in getting too in depth in the world building and supporting structure is I just want to tell a story. And I don't want to get too hung up on, the stuff that maybe, the elvish wedding that is never going to be in the story and the reader's not going to care about. So why does it matter?
Hey dude, I wrote Ewok wedding vows.
Well, nub.
And that's a story. I'll tell you that one later. Go ahead.
So let me ask, you can go to one extreme or the other. You can reuse tropes that everyone knows about. If you say a dragon, you don't have to say, then this lizard-like creature that breathed fire, and you don't have to do the explanation. So to what extent do you want to copy and paste existing tropes that the reader is already going to be familiar with and save yourself the effort of having to do any elaborate description of them versus coming up with something new completely from scratch and then accepting the burden of having to explain that somehow in a narrative way that isn't just an exposition.
Why are you giving this one to me? Well, I do kind of have that problem. I sort of creating creatures with these recent books out of thin air because they have to sort of fit a narrative, and I have a devilishly hard time coming up with names for them. But I find that in many instances, I sort of kind of describe them, kind of mention where they come from, make inferences about where they, where they existed or what they're doing, and let the reader piece that together. And I'm writing a lot of books. I intend on writing a lot of books. Hopefully, I won't keel over. That I'm going to put in additional pieces. My whole concept was to really write all these different books to allow readers to sort of theory craft things. But it gets, like I said, it gets definitely hard when you start creating new things out of thin air, and then you have to not only describe them, but you have to name them. And then I end up having to use different names all over the place when I'm describing things in an action scene, and it gets, I'm juggling words all over the place. So if I had a dragon, it would be a lot easier, but unfortunately I didn't do something smart.
Well, when you're it does create, when you're using tropes, those like the dragons or whatever else like that, it does create a common language that does save time. So
and not just time,
not
there's
just
a
time,
certain,
effort.
well, there's a certain nostalgic quality to fantasy where you want a certain amount of familiar things. Now, that being said, I think there's always a value to rethinking them, at least as far as what do they really represent in your background? Because then you can bring a certain amount of freshness even to an old idea, if you're kind of rethinking it from the point of view of what's really going on here. But there's certain writing techniques and certain tropes and things like that people warn against that in fantasy works really well, because you want that feeling of it's almost like you're in front of a cozy fire, and so bringing up things that people remember or they've seen or have a little bit of nostalgia is part of what the effect is you're trying to get. But then you want to balance it out by making sure that it's coming organically from your world and not just I'm sticking a dragon in here and haven't really thought about what that means.
It's kind of like Jim Butcher gives you the warm fuzzy of having werewolves, but then he gives you 6 different kinds that you've never thought of before. So that's kind of what you're talking about. You have to give your own spin on these familiar things to kind of make them your own. Now, I saw 2 questions. There's Rachel and then there's Joe. So go ahead, Rachel. You can have all the cute names and style is off, breaks. And I love the pretty little parts that I have. The actual like the total stuff. She has wonderful lines that in fantasy every word counts. And I am a very Jagi reader. I can so I can tell what the world is from the first sentence of the book. And style creates the world, and
Sure. Yeah, so Mhm. So my protagonist in my urban fantasy series is kind of, new to the game, so to speak. He's kind of just discovered that there's this undercurrent to the world that, he grew up and thought was normal. So he's almost an audience analog in that regard. So as he encounters the stuff, it's like he's just kind of, laughing and shaking his head like, oh, well, I guess this is real, and kind of to tie into what Hans was talking about, tropes and stuff. One of the ongoing jokes is that, vampires and werewolves aren't real in that universe just because I think they're played out, and boring. So I don't use them. And, so he makes a joke at one point, oh, where are the vampires? No such thing, man. What are you talking about? So yeah, it's just kind of a, and that helps build the world, I guess, in the sense that the audience is slowly, oh, this is okay. So this is it. This is what we're seeing now, that kind of thing. So.
If you're talking about language style, I read a lot of children's books, and my hero of all heroes of writers is Lloyd Alexander. So I tried to write kind of in that older children's style. I had an argument with my editor about this in the early days. He doesn't like that, you know, I use other words for said and I use adjectives and all these things. And I said, J.K. Rowling does it. And he said, okay. But I've heard people complain about the Harry Potter writing style, and I love it. To me, she perfectly gets the children's writing style, the thing I love from Alan Gardner and the old notebooks and Lloyd Alexander and all these children's books. Barbara Silver's Carbonell, Roald Dahl. And so that's the style I'm trying to write in. Now, I have a definite Zelazny influence. So I describe in fact, a early reader once described my books as Neil Gaiman meets C.S. Lewis, or for an American equivalent, Roger Zelazny meets Lloyd Alexander. And I said, nothing could better describe what I want to be as a writer. But that's what I'm trying to do. I have a little bit of the more kind of edgy, kind of, particularly in the Prospero series, not as much in this, but a little bit of the more kind of Zelazny-esque style. But I try for that familiar sense of children's book, simpler words, more colorful words, that a lot of the modern styles actually, you meet writers today and they say, it's a rule that you shouldn't use this kind of language. I'm like, it's not a rule.
There are no
That's the thriller style that was made popular by Hemingway and Elroy Leonard.
Yeah, Elmore Leonard.
Elmore Leonard.
Yeah.
And it's just a style, you know, it's not a rule. So I think it's really important to let people know. I'm a proud charter member of the Society for the Preservation of Adverbs.
And if there was an Elroy Leonard, I think he'd do that too.
Talking about style, I mean, of course, you know, some of the first stuff I wrote was imitating Conan Doyle, right? So doing Sherlock Holmes, and really, I mean, I read nothing but Doyle to do that. I could not read any imitations of Doyle, and to this day, I still cannot. You know, I have a hard time reading any pastiches. I just wanted to give honor to his voice and to imitate, and his best voice is when he's doing Watson and doing Watson well. All right. So imbuing myself in Doyle and trying to imitate his words. And I there are a couple of words that some people went, he would not have used this word. I was like, crap. But for the most part, I did my best to try to imitate Doyle. But I learned so much by doing that exercise. And so when it came for me to create my own universe, my own world of space fantasy and things like that, of course, I'm looking at, again, it starts with the characters, and my characters are the originated from ancient Sumeria. So what kind of culture was that, and how does that form their speech, and how should that form the speech that I represent them in? And so it's not highly elevated like you might have in high fantasy. It's a little bit more elevated when they're speaking. And then I created a contrast, because one of these characters was raised on Earth in the United States in New York. And so when he shows up, suddenly his language is just so contrasty to everybody else that it's funny. And he is a funny character, and he's so put upon, this poor boy. And in what he's trying to experience and learn by going through this, he becomes almost our person to follow. And you experience their language and the way that they're handled in that style. And so you kind of see the contrasting styles that way.
I'm kind of agree that, you know, the genre kind of dictates the language. I mean, really, if you're going to do something about the space trip to Mars, you're not going to be using these, thous, hithers, and thithers. So I cut my teeth on Tolkien, Robert E. Howard. I like that language, and I like writing in that style. So, and the feedback thus far has been that it's very well received. And I just want to make a thing about dragons. One of the things I never wanted to do was put a dragon in my book, because everybody puts a freaking dragon in their books. And then I told in one of the Iron Age chats about, you know, I'm not going to be doing a dragon. I got tongue lashed. So you got to put dragons in books if you're doing fantasy. Just a warning.
Now, Joe, you had a question earlier. Do you still remember it, or did you lose it?
Overdoing it as a world building, but maybe there was or say the wedding. But because there's a ceremony and it's done in a particular way, that's part of the culture of those elves. That is how elves carry themselves and their language. It's because, and you know, if you wouldn't maybe just for him, that was a mechanism that was like, I'm creating culture, and in that, this is what they do. So when I'm writing, this is going to come out because it's part of the culture. Created that culture.
I the thing about
I think you're right.
No, I think the thing about Tolkien is that he was actually, I mean, despite the fact that some people go off about how he'd spend like a whole page talking about a flower and a paragraph on a battle, he was an astute writer in that he only put in the things that he needed to get through the story. I mean, there are some people who really get into culture. He wasn't really a culture guy, I don't think, personally. I think he was more of a philosophical guy. He dealt more with philosophy and I think grander vision and grander things. That's just my perspective.
I think you also, as a writer, you don't know what you're going to write about. So he didn't know he wasn't going to put an Elvish wedding in till later.
Yeah.
Yeah, he might have said, I create this because I could probably use it later. And then, I mean, there's lots of things I have written that I have set aside that I may use later, and I didn't use them. But they're still interesting to me. And as you said, Joe, they do form the basis. And yes, he kind of was creating, I mean, when he created his backstories and everything else like that, all the stuff that you didn't see in Lord of the Rings that came about later in Silmarillion, which I can't say that word, you get that sense of culture that he did create some of, because when you're creating language, you're creating culture. So the Elvish, which is a language, which is a culture, and then of course he's creating this wedding it's a liturgy, and of course being Catholic, he was very big on liturgy. That liturgy forms his consciousness and also forms part of the culture. So
I spent several years researching something that was supposed to go in my latest novel. I had to take it out because the novel went in a slightly different direction. I then wrote a short story about the same thing. I couldn't fit it in there either. Several years of research. No one will ever know about it. On the subject of dragons, I just wanted, so this was a fan-made scarf that I have. This is Lucky the Dragon, who's one of the favorite characters in I walked into a panel at Liberty Con once on my birthday, and she gave me this. Felt I should thank her for it. Question mark?
I would say I suspect Tolkien is not an author in that sense. He made that stuff up because he made up the world and then put the story.
You may be right.
Yeah, no, he was writing all that stuff, I think, all the way through like World War One. Yeah, he just did it for himself. And I think what happened was he published The Hobbit. He originally wrote The Hobbit for his kids, if I remember correctly. And then the publisher came back and said, that's great, give us something else. And then he went away for I don't know how many decades, came back with Lord of the Rings. Actually, I don't think it's like 10 or 13 years or something like that. Came back with Lord of the Rings. And they were like, it's not a children's book. I'm sure it was a bit of a shock.
Was a member of a group, I think it was 4 friends who were really close, and 2 of them died in World War II. And he felt as a promise to them that he had to do something great to kind of carry forward their memory and the spirit of what the 4 of them had wanted to do together. I guess the 2 that lived said this, and Tolkien actually achieved it. So it's kind of a... What's it? But Lewis was not one of those 4 friends. He didn't meet him till later. This was just 4 youthful friends of his that had been really close, and I don't remember the name of the other one who lived. Yeah, the Inklings were later.
It can also be a convergence of multiple things too. I mean, no one I think in a lot of people's lives, no one thing drives them to do something. In my opinion. outside of me having to reside my house.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
You got a question?
Yeah.
See, maybe Doyle need to read his stories to his kids, because then they would have called him out when he changed Watson's name in one story.
That would have been good. My husband has a 3-hour version of Jack and the Beanstalk that tells the kids, and one of these days we should try to get him to write it down.
The fandom can be harsh.
Kids are the best beta readers. My teenage son read my series, and I got a very stern lecture after he got to the point where I killed the character.
I think when my son Ray, he read my first space fantasy book, and then he's like, it's too romantic, Mom." And he was like, he would come in, I'd be watching a Jane Austen, he goes, "That's why it's in your book."
He didn't ask if it was a kissing book before you
Yeah,
read
he
it?
didn't ask if it was a kissing book ahead of time. He probably should have.
This is a kissing book.
I need more action. Yeah, Declan thing agrees with you. I need more action in my books.
So
Actually, you should read Declan's books for me. I think you'd like it.
there's a lot of action in Declan's
There's
book.
a lot of action. I don't think there's a chapter that doesn't begin or end with that.
You have the explosions in the background while
I must say, you're talking about the plot building rather than world building, but it's really hard when you're writing a story about a girl at school to try to fit in several action or fight scenes. You know, because it takes a lot of creativity.
Time in anime.
Well, yeah, but I mean, either the adults are idiots, or and so then she's not getting attacked. So I have to be really creative with the last book. I needed a fight scene at the beginning because I had a long, boring scene. It's not boring, but a very just talking scene after that. And I couldn't come up with a way to just have her attacked. And finally I thought, instead of having her sneak out for the 5th time, I'm just going to have her go somewhere with her dad and they're going to be attacked. So I was able to do it kind of legitimately. But, it takes a certain amount of creativity to figure out how to get the action.
You have something else?
I just wanted to point out, hey, Joe, what was the name of that anime series with the chicks that were in tanks?
Oh, Girls and Panthers.
Girls and Panzers.
Girls and Panzers,
Talk about
yeah.
world building. Oh my goodness. Little, Japanese schoolgirls all in tanks.
They have a tank club.
They have a
instead of
tank club,
flower
and they
club.
we all have tournaments against each other, and it's just like, oh my gosh, it's a crazy show.
In my defense, I read that 20 years ago. No, I mean, yeah, I mean, sometimes you gotta run in there and fill in the gaps with spackle. So, and people are gonna want to know. So.
Declan
I love Tom Bombadil.
Declan Finn wrote a review of one of my books where he said I covered everything but taxes, so I had to put a reference to taxes in the next book. So there's a scene where they're dealing with the taxes for the magical
Oh my
world.
gosh, that's a great idea. Now I gotta tackle taxes. Oh my gosh, death and
It's
taxes.
short, but it fits.
Death and taxes.
All right, we're coming up on our time. Anybody
Yep.
have any final thoughts? Or
Just do you have a question?
This isn't a question, but could you talk about One Piece?
It's really funny you said that because I've
One
been
Piece.
wanting to talk about One Piece this whole time. So here we go. So the best storyteller out there right now, the best world building is Oda, the author of One Piece. So the first One Piece is currently 1,075 episodes of the anime and slightly more of the manga. The first sections of it take place in kind of a typical fantasy place. The second sections take place in kind of fantasy Arabia and fantasy Venice. And then you get to the point where he starts inventing places worthy of entire science fiction series for every new island they go to. So there's the island where everything has these bubbles that makes things float, and the whole thing is on, what are those? Say it again? Mangrove. The whole thing's a giant mangrove. There's an island that's half fire and half ice. There's an island where the magic allows them to turn people into toys, and when it happens, all your loved ones forget you. I mean, and then the next island is entirely made of cake. It's Cold Cake Island. And each of these places, he does the amount of world building that we would expect for an entire series he spends a year or two on each arc, but for just one section. And the basic story is there's a boy who wants to be the king of the pirates. To do that, he has to make it all the way around his world to get the One Piece, which is something that has something to do with the lost century of history. And to do this, he has to fight all the bad guys on the way. But the world building, the storytelling, this guy does, in nearly every long-running series, people forget the qualities of the characters. They start kind of just becoming almost like a caricature of themselves. Not this guy. Every single character maintains their crispness. They all have like a strength and a crazy vice, and they balance the lesser characters. Sometimes the vices are just annoying, but the major characters, they balance the character really well, and there's reasons for them. And it's just the most inventive, most delightful. The characters, you talk about subversiveness, everything. He's the most satisfying writer I've ever come upon. Like when you really, really want something to happen, it almost always does 300 episodes later. But it's worth waiting for. And the world building is just terrific. And he ties things. When you go back and watch the beginning, you realize he had some of it made up from the beginning because there are little references to things that you thought he made up much later. He does retcon in one character, but he does it so well that I forgive him. So he just does a brilliant job at story building. He does a brilliant job at plotting. He does a brilliant job at characterization. And he makes these islands you go to, each of which are like a complete, you could just put a whole series there. So I really recommend the series, even though it's kind of long. The new Netflix live action doesn't have a lot of the good quality of the original, but it does it pretty well. It's like a good intro for anybody who wants to see if they like it or not. It's fantastic.
Okay. I don't have any other final thoughts because I started with the live action. So I watched the live action One Piece, and now I've started on the anime. But she's recommending certain episodes so I can get the gist of what the whole series is like and see if I really want to commit to 1,000 episodes. My son's going, "You don't want to do that, Mom." But yeah, maybe I do.
I'm still arguing with my kids over the last Airbender, so I'm out of One Piece.
My husband and I sit there and watch it, and we're like, this guy's better than us. We've got to up our game.
Okay.
All right. I think we're good. Everybody, thank you for coming. And see you.